Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Katie Schaefer. Today we're talking all about the 2000 unfinished novel from Stephen King called The Plant. It's one that I think most fans who are really into the idea of reading everything he's written have probably heard about, but maybe not for your sort of everyday average Stephen King fan. I had no idea this existed until I started creating the spreadsheet for this podcast. And Katie, I know this was one where I was kind of like, I don't know if anyone's going to want to talk about this one.
Yeah, and I'd heard about it. I think I remember when he was releasing this on his website and oh God, what was that? Like 2000 something? Yeah, July of 2000s looks like when he's published it as an ebook. And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting, the plant, huh? I wonder what kind of plant he means." But then I just never got to it. So this was my first time reading it, and honestly, I kind of liked it. I thought I was surprised at how interesting it was almost immediately. Like once I got about 4 or 5 pages in, I was like, I want to know what's going on here.
I think it took me a little longer to get into it, and I think that's just because I have been a little behind in my reading, to be honest. And I'm kind of like, okay, gotta power through these next few books here. And the funny thing with this one is he actually started writing this in the 80s, and he wrote a few parts in like 82, 83, and 85. And I think this version in 2000 changed a little, but it's very much like he wanted to release it in a similar way to how he released The Green Mile.
Yep, that's what I felt too. And this one is, it felt another like one of his experiments in storytelling in both format and release type because this is almost entirely an epistolary novel. So it's all letters and notes and memos and that kind of thing. There's no typical like just text
Right.
of writing. So I thought that worked pretty well with how it probably worked exceptionally well if you were reading it like as an ebook installment on your computer.
Mm-hmm.
But it still works even though I have like a printed out copy that I got. So
Yeah, and initially you had to pay for this. You don't have to if you go to Stephen King's website right now, which, if I'm being honest, looks like it hasn't been updated in quite a while, but it is functional, I guess. You know, I could go there, I could find the plant, I could download parts 1 through 3 and 4 through 6, but it does still remain unfinished. So that was something that was interesting to me. And honestly, when I first made the spreadsheet, I saw that and I was like, do I want to cover something that's unfinished? But because it's still almost 300 pages long, I felt like there was enough there to justify at least talking about it, even if it's just, one of our shorter episodes here.
I agree because it's interesting for him and it kind of taps into something a little different that he hasn't necessarily done before. I mean, all of his books are a little different, but this one I think I really enjoyed how different it was. And I think it kind of wraps up. It doesn't leave you completely unsatisfied.
Right.
It's more like one of his, like the ending or the feeling you get at the end of one of his shorts, where it feels like it's supposed to be leaving you wanting more as opposed to getting that cathartic conclusion that he usually does.
Yeah. So let's talk about our basically two main characters in John and Carlos, because Carlos Detweiler is this writer who finds the Zenith publishing house, and then the editor, John, he kind of feels like this guy is a crackpot, and his manuscript is a little weird because it's sort of about magic, but then there's these very realistic photos, and it just starts him going down this sort of rabbit hole eventually to figure out what's kind of going on with this. And Carlos just keeps coming back and coming back and coming back, and you get this push and pull between these two characters, even though, like you said, this isn't your typical kind of novel. It's a very different format.
Yeah, it is. Like having it just be this, letters and diaries and stuff makes it so that there's not nearly as much character, not nearly quite as much character development as King usually gets. Like we get inside their heads because generally, I think the majority of it is diary entries. By the end of the book, at least, certainly the second half of the book is far more diary entries than it is like memos and letters. And So that allows us to see a little bit more who these people are. But since we're not like floating along in their heads through the events that are happening, like he's very limited in how much he can give us that he normally doesn't have to deal with those limitations. And I liked that it's in those format because I like reading those kind of books. And it was interesting how many different kinds of correspondence he includes, because that
Hmm.
allows the world to like spread a little bit. You know, we get to see some of Carlos's book, which is, oh boy, a little nutty. And then you get to find out about John's relationship with his, you know, ex-girlfriend through the letters he's writing her. And so you kind of get to see, that's how we get to see like different sides of people. And so I liked how he did it, how he did that.
Yeah, I really just like how he portrayed these characters through these various means of communication. And the fact that he began working on this again in 2000, but it's still very reflective of this 80s kind of communication. You know, you have these inner office memos. They're not emails or anything. And yes, 2000 was still a little early for that, maybe, but you get a sense that this was just a totally different time and the way of communicating was completely different in the office space.
Right. They're all using typewriters. No one's using a computer. None of this is printed out like they, when, especially when John is talking about reading through the manuscripts, because the whole, you know, being an editor, he's just, you get bits of books and you read through them and decide if you want to publish them.
Right.
And he talks about some of them being pencil, and they go into the detail about, you know, what kind of font and carrier and typewriters all of these different people are using. And it doesn't really strike me until that point, which is pretty late in the book. I was like, oh yeah, I suppose this was during the time of no computers. No one would have been using that. They, especially in like such a rundown place, they still would have been typing away, clickety clacking on their old typewriters.
And obviously, in 2000, you would have had computers. You know, my parents had a computer when I was growing up, and they certainly had, you know, bulkier computers back then. But I think there was just something about this era where you could kind of have these weirder things happening in a totally different way, because obviously with the internet now, a lot of people can be anonymous if they want to be. And yes, you have people who can track down IP addresses and find out where someone is located and all this stuff. But when you have this sort of threatening person who keeps trying to intimidate you and sends you stuff in the mail, and you keep getting these, you know, weird things arriving in your office, and then you get a plant of all things, you're kind of like, okay, what's going on with this person?
Yeah, yeah, he seems very nutty from the beginning, and it even more so for me because of how the book is written, because we don't get almost anything from Carlos. Like we get just a little bit, just enough to know that, to confirm our suspicions that he isn't like, he isn't nuts. These things are actually happening. He can actually do these things.
Yeah.
And I also thought that was interesting. Did you see any similarities in that? Like, you know, in the scene where Carlos gives up the ghost, as it were, and he's saying like "cantac" and stuff like that. I was like, is this related to other things? And there's a mention of falling off the beam at one point. One of the characters says something just real casually as an aside, but you know, I'm always looking as I read to find those little pearls of connection to other Stephen King works. And I was wondering, did you see any in this as you were reading through?
I kept getting this feeling that there was something there, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it, because with King, you always have this notion that he's going to throw something in there, and you probably have to be paying very close attention to get it. And unfortunately, with the pace that I'm reading everything at, I more often than not will miss some of them, which is a bit of a bummer because I want to catch all of those things for the podcast. There are some obvious ones, like I'm reading Dreamcatcher now, and they go back to Derry, and it's like, okay, you know, that one's like hitting you right in the face with it.
Right, right. Locations, Castle Rock, Derry, that type of thing. Yeah, I don't think there was much, honestly. And I wonder, I wonder if he ever intended to finish this, or if it was just like a fun experiment of like, let's just see where it goes, because it does have the feel of something that is not as edited as his work usually is, with how tight everything is almost, which sounds weird, but it doesn't sound like it doesn't feel when I read it that he had the time to kind of stretch out the story and elaborate on a lot of different things. It
Mm-hmm.
almost feels like an outline of one of King's books, like just the bare minimum of what's going on. And then
Yeah.
we get these few nice splashy scenes, usually at least one really well done scene in each part of the book. And then there's that ending that felt like, I guess this could be an end of one of his stories. It's nothing like his ends are now. It feels much more reminiscent of his early work rather than, The Stand or something.
Yeah, it was kind of like how you get that ending with Christine where it wraps up, but you also know there's more to the story.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that worked for me, as much as I'm willing to give him a lot of leeway. And with this one especially, it was like, this is obviously a very experimental book.
Mm-hmm.
So not sure where we're going to go with this. What did you think of the characters?
I thought they were just interesting enough to get you through this crazy story because, like you said, this was shorter than a lot of his other stuff. It was still pretty long for being something that was unfinished, but I felt like the tension between Carlos and John was done well enough to where Carlos could do all of these different things, and you're kind of learning more as we go because a lot of this is focused in the publisher's office with the inner office memos and everything is coming to that office. You have Ridley in the mailroom and you have some unfortunate conversations about him since he is a black man working in this publishing house in the mailroom, which seems to be in like some dark, dingy basement or something.
It was on the fifth floor. That because I remember that which elevator button he pushed, and I was shocked when they said it was on the fifth floor. I was like, this doesn't feel like it was in anywhere but, like you said, a dark, dingy basement.
Yeah, it's like they did something weird to that floor just to make it a place that no one really wanted to go to.
Yeah, yeah, it feels like a forgotten place, and maybe that's because of how all the editors and all the characters talk about the office and how the company is got like 6 months left before they're going to get sold or whatever, so it does feel very like a place that has not much hope left in it.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't get a whole lot of describing of the settings, I noticed, from
No.
that, because why would you describe your own office in your diary?
Yeah.
You know what your office looks like. You're not going to put that in there. And I think that is the only time we get a lot of more description is like when they go to Detweiler's, because he's a florist. He's like a florist assistant
Yeah.
out in Rhode Island. And so they go to his place of work after he is long gone from there. And then we do get like a really rich description of what the greenhouse looks like and what the plants are like and all of that. And that really helped it feel not quite so flat of a story, because there is a little bit of flatness in that you can't really imagine like what the room's like that these people are in. You just kind of get a vague impression.
Except for the bathroom. We get like a weird descriptive bathroom scene.
Yep, that was odd. That was odd. And of course, as always in a King book, we got somebody peeing.
Yeah.
Always in every book, I swear.
It's a running theme.
Yeah, it's like how Tom Cruise runs in every single one of his movies. There always has to be that shot of him running very heroically.
That's a good one.
Just much grosser. But I would have liked more character development. And I wonder if we would have gotten that had this book been published, or this story. Maybe it would have just been in like one of his, like as the novella in a collection or something. I could see that. Like, I wonder if we would have gotten more character development if he hadn't published it this way.
Yeah. I do like it when authors experiment with their formats, though, because I think by this point, King was in a very good position to try something new. And while he has mostly stuck to the same kinds of releases, you have your novels, you have your short story collections, you have something like If It Bleeds, that's a novella collection, and you have these basically 3 different types of books that we've seen King release, The Green Mile being the one serialized exception. And that even at the time seemed pretty experimental for him and for the publisher, because it was kind of like, okay, he needs to crank these out so we can release them. It's not like he wrote the whole thing all at once and they just chopped it up.
It was a throwback experiment, because that's
Yeah.
definitely how a lot of books were written in like the 1800s and early 1900s. They were written as chapbooks or released in parts in the newspaper or whatever. So this, though, it feels kind of like that, but also different.
Yeah, that's how it started. When he had started working on it in the 80s, he sent them out as chapbooks, and he was like sending those instead of sending people Christmas cards, which is kind of funny.
Those are worth $1 million at least.
Oh, yeah. I kind of looked around out of curiosity, and when the publisher actually physically released these back whenever they did that, you cannot find these in a physical copy now. But, like you said, you have yours all in a binder printed out. So you technically can make it a physical copy if you really want to. It just won't be bound like a book.
Right, exactly. Yeah, one of my friends got it printed and then put it in so it's like a book. It has a ring binder. Like it works. It's fine. It's easily readable. So that's all I ask of it. So because I'm not one to read on a tablet unless it's a comic book. I think you could still read them pretty easily on a computer if you were reading them like as installments, because they're pretty short. Like this is 6 parts, and it's like 270 pages is what my copy comes to, and that's single-sided. So it's like, and it's the size of a thick trade paperback, I would say. But I feel like I was surprised at the end of every chapter or part or whatever. I was like, oh, it's over already.
Yeah. It was a very fast read for me too, and I was reading it on my iPad. I downloaded the PDF, and it actually looked like it was formatted perfectly fine, which I find does not happen super often with PDFs when you put them like on the Kindle app or something. They're like all janky, and I was like, okay, this one actually looks nice. So I was able to get through it much faster than I anticipated, because sometimes when the formatting is thrown off for like ebook copies, I just struggle so hard to get through it, because it's like they'll have a watermark for advanced copies in the middle of a sentence, and I'm like, what are you doing?
Now I have to use context to figure out what this says, and that doesn't work all the time. Yeah, I know that feeling too. I've read stuff like that very periodically. And yeah, sometimes I'll get an ebook that I need or whatever, and I'm like, really? I think you maybe needed to spend a little more on your format, whoever did your formatting. But it doesn't surprise me that King would say, like, here, make this look nice. It needs to be readable. I don't care about anything else. Just make sure people can read it.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things this story does well, and I don't have too terribly much to say about this. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't something that really stood out to me outside of the format, because he does such great character work a lot. But with John, as you see his sort of downward spiral, I think that was one of my favorite parts of the story, where he's just getting more and more obsessed, and he thinks, this lady's name is really the writer, and he turns out to be right, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, it was. And I think how it skews in the end, because I really felt, because we're not getting as much character development, I was at a loss as to, okay, how are these people going to be affected by this plant, and how is it going to turn out? And then at the very end, they're talking about like they are all in on this game, and it's just, oh my, bad things are going to happen is what it feels like. Like I have very little hope that whatever went down with those people went down well.
Yeah.
In the aftermath. I mean, that's definitely what it seems like, because I think the book ends, with them essentially dumping Detweiler's body at a dump used by the mafia. Like, if this is where you're ending up, I don't know. Your future is very bright, regardless of how lucky your plant's going to make you.
Yeah, it was one of those out there stories. And I was like, okay, obviously there's going to be a plant, because there's no way that Stephen King names this the plant and there isn't a significant plant in this.
Yep. And then when it comes, it starts so small. Detweiler sends them this little ivy plant that none of them can really identify. It just looks like ivy, which, by the way, in the room I'm recording in today, I have slightly creepy. There is a giant ivy plant that stretches down from a tall bookshelf. So I was like, oh, I never thought of that as a little creepy before. But after I just finished reading this book, it's now a little creepy. So, it starts out so small and sickly. And then by the end of the book, it is essentially taking over this entire office and is telepathically communicating with them. And it happens so quickly in the course of the story that I at least almost didn't realize it until all of a sudden there it is, being the monster.
Yeah, and I think the image that stuck with me the most out of this entire story was that image of the plant in the office, and it takes over and it's just complete chaos in there.
Yep. And the nice description we get of the office when the plant is like bursting through the walls, like it's, like ivy does, if you've ever seen an old house getting slowly pulled down by the ivy on the walls, like it creaks and finds its way through these cracks and then makes them bigger. But that's all happening in fast motion, as it were, because they leave Friday night and then they come back Saturday afternoon, and the plant is, through multiple walls at that point, as opposed to just one that they see when they leave Friday. So this thing is growing just so rapidly that it seems very intimidating as a reader to see that. Like, it would be intimidating to have to come into an office and see something like that.
Yeah, I have one last question for you, and then we can get to anything else you want to talk about specifically. But do you think this is something you could see King returning to? Obviously, he's getting up there in age, and it's one of those things where every day I'm like, okay, there's a select few celebrities who are getting up there in age that I am like worried about
Right?
health wise, especially during, COVID now. And, it wouldn't be weird for him to pick up a story years later, because we saw he wrote The Shining in 1977, and Doctor Sleep released in 2017 or something. So there was a 40-year gap in order to continue that story.
Right. And it took him how long to finish The Dark Tower? So it's definitely something. I don't know if he will. I don't know if it's an interesting enough story for him to come back to.
Yeah.
Because it does kind of feel like it's this thing that's tossed off. But then he also has, over the years, come back to it. Because like you said, he started writing this in 1985, and then just has written it in little bits up until 2000, when he released it as in the ebook way. So it's always possible. And I would be interested. I would read it again if he came out and published it as like he did with The Stand, the adjusted version of it, and gave us more and put in a different end, or not even a different ending. You would just pick up the story from where it's at and keep going.
Yeah.
Like, I would absolutely read more of it just to see, because I want to know what happens to those people and if any of them make it out of there alive. I don't think they will, but
right.
And you get that little hint about John's ex-girlfriend, that Carlos drops, where she's in California, and he says, oh, now she's figured out that she's chosen the wrong man, and she's going to be coming back in a couple weeks to look for John. So we know that there's more going on, and we can kind of see what the future might hold. And so I would love to see him flesh that out, but who knows? I mean, how many books has he published this year? 3? 2 at least. And we're in July.
Has it been 2 already?
When did The Institute come out?
Last September.
Okay, maybe that's the one I was thinking of, because he's released 1 already this year, I thought.
Yeah. If It Bleeds, I think, was the May book.
Yeah, so I must have been thinking of The Institute. But I imagine we'll be getting another one before the end of the year.
But it's still within the year, like a year period, so.
Yeah, there we go. That's what I was thinking. That's how we're going to sell it. Yeah,
it's been a long week, guys.
It's a very long week. Every week is a long week these days.
Touche. Well, is there anything else you want to touch on before we wrap up? I know I mentioned this would be a shorter episode, and that's partially my doing because I'm a little behind on reading.
Yeah, and I mean, this is not This really does feel like a short story, or not even, it doesn't even have, I would say, like all the complexities that, say, the body does.
Mm-hmm.
Like the body, which I think is maybe this long, probably a little shorter, has so much more going on in it. This is, for all the complexities, this still feels like a pretty simple story. I think the only thing that I really wanted to bring up was how interesting and different the supernatural stuff feels in this. Like, it
Yes.
fits very much into King, but how it's portrayed and like the casual doubt that is given to it so much of the time up until like the last part of the book is, I just thought that was a interesting direction for him to go in, especially within this kind of a story, both in format and content.
Yeah, this was definitely an interesting one all around. Not my favorite thing, not my least favorite thing either. So that's always good. And I've really enjoyed just getting to experience all of these things chronologically because it helps you kind of get a sense of where King has gone as a writer over the years.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And you can see such a difference between, you know, this work or the last one we covered, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, and It, or The Stand, or Carrie, and so on and so forth. Like, he really has grown and uses his vast resources as a writer, as in he can get whatever he wants published. He doesn't just keep, he's not like a Tom Clancy or James Patterson where he just keeps putting out the same thing over and over and over again. Like,
Which is also fine.
King, totally fine. Totally fine. No judge on those writers or people who enjoy them. But he keeps pushing and experimenting and trying new things. And I think that's probably why he stayed such a successful author, because he keeps going and keeps like, how can I challenge myself this time around? I think is what he kind of does. And so it's always interesting because you never quite know what you're going to get with the new Stephen King book. You could get something like Joyland or Mr. Mercedes or something, which are much more like classic mystery novels.
Crime novels.
Yeah, thank you. Or you can get Dr. Sleep.
Yeah.
So it's always just so up in the air.
Keeps things interesting, that is for sure.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. Well, Katie, thank you so much for coming on for a quick chat about this one. You will be back at some point. I'd have to look at the spreadsheet to know exactly when, but you're always going to be back at some point.
Yes, always. It's the best. So, well, thank you so much for having me. And if you guys want to read it, I would say it's worth your time. Give it a chance.
And it's free.
Exactly. And it's a free little thing that you can read in snippets, and it won't feel like it's something that you're missing out on by not being able to sit down and just plow through it.
Exactly. All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.